Next up, we're going to take a look at the 40th President of the United States, George Bush, or George Herbert Walker Bush, as we've kind of had to designate him because his son came later. Again, the five criteria are growth, finances, international politics, war and security, and did they leave the country better or worse? Bush, I don't want to say he was left a mess because I don't think that's entirely fair, but he was left a lot of messes. There were a lot of things that he had to clean up that Reagan left behind, as I kind of discussed under Reagan. And that's part of why I didn't give Reagan the greatest, better, or worse score, because I think that when Reagan left office, the recession that eventually would come in the early part of the Bush presidency was already in place and kind of emerging, on top of already having a huge deficit that Bush then had to address because of the deficit spending of the era that came before. And so I don't think his presidency was a time of huge growth, but I don't necessarily know that that was entirely his fault. I think there was growth during his presidency, and I think a lot of the decisions he made would contribute to a lot of later growth. And I had difficulty with that because I almost wanted to score him higher in terms of growth because of what he inherited and what he left behind, but that's not really how this works. This is really looking at the presidency, and that would fall under better or worse, which I will grade him very high, little spoilers for the end of this video. So in terms of growth and in terms of finances, I can't give him particularly high grades because he didn't have a great financial situation because he inherited some recessions. Now, he didn't inherit anything near to what many other presidents inherited in far worse situations. I don't want to overestimate it or over expand on it, but he was inheriting a country that had peaked, that had kind of had a big sugar rush in a lot of ways, I would argue, and was kind of leveling out. And I think he did a very good job managing it. But this also created a huge amount of controversy. One of the things that, if you were around during that time, which I was, you'll remember is people saying, read my lips, no new taxes. And he had to break that promise because he did need new taxes because of the deficit and because of the debt. And I think that might have cost him re-election. Even though he stayed, relatively popular throughout his presidency, it was a problem that he was going against Republican doctrine on taxes that was almost near religious. There, you could not raise taxes. And when doing these videos, I'm always happy that it did work the way I wanted to. And now we're getting to 40 is like watching how things changed over time, how it wasn't as big of a deal for Ford. But then when you go in order and look at the change over time, you can really see the pain points where a lot of philosophical doctrine changed between the parties and really got locked in. And so the read my lips, no new taxes really hurt him with regards to his reputation, but I do think it was the right thing to do with regards to finances and growth. But again, because his 4 years in office really wasn't a time of great economic growth because of a number of factors, which we'll also get to in international politics. Can't rate him that high on growth or finances because he did still also have a huge debt, even with the changes that he made because of expenses, some of which were necessary. I would say most of which were necessary. I have a very favorable opinion of George H.W. Bush, honestly. I think his presidency is sometimes overlooked, and I think a lot of things he did were a real stepping stone that built a lot of the growth that I think Bill Clinton gets credit for. But at the same time, I do have to acknowledge that his presidency had recession, had all the things that happened. So again, I'm not going to give him incredibly high scores on growth or finances, but if you wanted to and put him higher, I would not disagree with you. I can see the argument. In terms of our international politics, I think he is one of the best presidents ever. When I was sitting here remembering all the things he did and the decisions he had to make and why the decisions came about, they weren't really decisions he got to make. And he kind of was confronted, and he seemed to generally make the right decision. No president is perfect. I'm not giving him a perfect score on this. He made mistakes, and he made a number of mistakes, and there were a lot of things that he did that he disagreed with. But on the major decision points, I think particularly let's start with the START treaty. That was great. Negotiations with Russia. The thing I praised Reagan most for was taking the right approach to Russia to avoid huge destabilization. I think he did a great job with regards to the START treaty, with regards to the reunification of Germany. I think the Panama invasion, which is often cited, I don't necessarily think that was his fault. I think that was a necessary thing created, quite frankly, by a lot of the Reagan policies, which were propping up a lot of Central American and South American dictators because of the anti-communist ideology. We had shifted from sending troops to sending money, as we've discussed. And again, I'm very happy that this series worked out the way I wanted it to, where as you're talking about the other presidents and you can kind of see the morphing in policy, you can see the good and the bad of each thing. So instead of us sending troops to stop, a communist expansion or fear of dominant theory and all that, we were sending money and weapons, and then all of a sudden now you're propping up these dictators like Noriega, who now we have to deal with. You're propping up the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, who we'll later have to deal with. And so these kind of things that were left as almost mines for Bush, I think he navigated well. Because one of the things that I think Bush did amazingly well that very few presidents have is understand mission creep. Understand we're here to do a specific thing. We're not here we didn't try to reconquer Panama and occupy, and we were there to get rid of Noriega, and then we move on. The best example of this is obviously the first Gulf War. Iraq invades Kuwait. That breaks all sorts of international beliefs and standards. And it also would have created a situation where Iraq would have had a huge funding source, which we didn't want to do for any number of reasons. Saddam Hussein having access to that much oil wealth would have been incredibly problematic. So was it about oil? 100% it was about oil. It was about oil and also making sure that Saddam Hussein did not have control of that oil, which would have been an incredibly bad thing for any number of reasons. And he was able to build international consensus and coalition. He was able to go in there and push Iraq out, and he stopped. He didn't get caught by mission creep, which so many other presidents have, going back to the Vietnam War, going forward into Afghanistan. He understood that I was here for a specific purpose. I may detest Saddam Hussein. I may think that his administration is abhorrent, but that's not what we're here for. We're not here to take over the problem. We're here to protect international boundaries, protect international goals. I wish that mindset had continued on with his son, and it's incredibly frustrating that it didn't. I'm obviously giving you spoilers for future videos, probably one that I'll actually record later today, as I think we're finishing up the series soon. But I think he did a great job. One of the ones I would criticize him for is obviously the Tiananmen Square response. But I think at that time, I understand it. We were trying to have a detente with China in the same way we had a detente with the Soviet Union. I think the mindset at the time, and it wasn't entirely inaccurate, was that China was pivoting away from such a focus on the things that he was opposed to. I don't want to get into the whole argument of capitalism versus communism versus socialism. I'm not going into those weeds, but I think the idea was China could be a less than perfect ally rather than being a full enemy. And I think the idea was also the Soviet Union was kind of becoming a less than perfect ally rather than an enemy. And having the idea that we don't have to have these firm, locked in ideological wars is not a bad thing. Now, the Tiananmen Square massacre needed to be condemned, and there was some late sanctions and probably not significant enough sanctions. So I'm not saying that George W. Bush is a perfect president in terms of international politics. But again, we've been doing this series now up to 40 presidents, and this is a comparative analysis. We're not comparing presidents to the perfect. We're comparing to the most came before and after. And I think he did an excellent job with regards to international politics and should be rated very highly. Similarly, in terms of war and security, I think the fact that, yes, we did engage in wars, but they were very targeted wars, they were very specific wars with very clear missions, and I think both of the wars were necessary. It is necessary to keep the Panama Canal open. It is necessary to have it not in the hands of someone who I think was arguably a drug trafficker. I think that war was a necessary war, probably created by policies that came before that propped up Noriega and allowed him to take and control power there. Again, when you prop up dictators, bad things happen. But I think that was a necessary war that I think time has shown that was correct and necessary. I think the first Gulf War, again, when it was done, it was done. Saddam Hussein was significantly weakened. Iraq was significantly weakened. There was a greater stabilization in that area than had been for some time. And the future peace talks that kind of sprung out of that Clinton, we'll get to when we talk to Clinton, I think were because of the understanding that the United States was a dominant world power, that was the superpower, and could come in and just win. And so you didn't want to pick a fight with the United States. That was such a decisive victory with a clear end. At that point, I would almost say that was near the peak of U.S. influence and power internationally. And that was under the first Bush administration. In regards to better or worse, I think that I would argue that George H.W. Bush left the country significantly better than he found it. In addition to things that I discussed earlier, the Americans with Disabilities Act was outstanding. The Immigration Act of 1990, which expanded illegal immigration, was not perfect, but it was an improvement. I think George H.W. Bush lost re-election because of a similar reason, although they're very, very different people. Let me be very clear. They're very, very different. I think George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter both were people who did what needed to be done, even if it wasn't popular. I think George H.W. Bush, with regards to Read My Lips, No New Taxes, and also his leaving of the NRA in protest, which I couldn't. Can you even imagine a modern Republican senator doing? Modern Republican president doing that now? Because he disagreed with the NRA's on assault weapons. I think George H.W. Bush did the things that he thought were right. And I think more often than not, he was right. Was he perfect? No, far from it. There are many policies that he instituted that I fundamentally disagree with. Um, and so I'm not going to put him incredibly high on the list. I don't think he's like a top 10, but he's not far from it. When I'm looking through the list, I ended up with him falling in at number 11, just behind Dwight Eisenhower and before James Madison, which is an incredibly high score. I think George H.W. Bush is a very underrated president. And so, again, on my list, currently he is at number 11.